All right, so we have one more keynote presentation, so it's now my pleasure to introduce Professor Andy Bommarius. Andy is a professor of chemical and biomolecular engineering as well as chemistry and biochemistry here at Georgia Tech. He received his degree in chemistry at the Technical University in Germany and his chemical engineering degree, both his BS and his PhD from MIT. He spent his first decade developing a laboratory in Germany and then joined Georgia Tech in 2000, where his research now covers green chemistry and biomolecular engineering, specifically biocatalyst development and protein stability studies. He, in 2008, became a fellow of the American Institute of Medical and Biological Engineering, and he also has become director of an NSF-funded center in 2010 on the Center for Pharmaceutical Development. And today, Andy's going to talk to us about pharma development in the age of the patent cliff. So, thank you, Andy.
So Bob, again, thank you very much for the introduction. And I'd like to sort of give you a couple of impressions and then maybe also a couple of sort of forward-looking thoughts in a situation these days that is characterized by the patent cliff. So I'm going to talk about what that patent cliff is and how it impacts us all in pharma, and then come up with essentially two themes. One is energizing development, and there I'm going to be talking about insourcing from academia, but maybe not in quite the same way as some of the speakers already alluded to before. And then also energizing manufacturing as one area that is not immediately associated with sort of pharma as an industry, but one that holds enormous promise, not just in terms of green chemistry, but also in terms of green with respect to saving money and being able to run just so many more new discovery projects. So the patent cliff right here, essentially, and we're talking about 2012 here, means a set of drugs, starting with Singulair against asthma, Montelukast by Merck, 1.3 billion, and if that sounds a lot, as you roll further to the cliff, in fact, you'll see that the revenues, the annual revenues keep increasing, all the way to Advair by GSK against asthma and COPD. And the value of these drugs alone that will go off patent in 2012 is about $33 billion. If you look at the total drug sales, $307 billion, you notice that this is a substantial fraction of this, and that's just going to go away, essentially, because the generics that follow up that phase, the on-patent phase, generics are typically 5 to 6 times cheaper than protected drugs. In other words, if you keep manufacturing and selling the drug, you only will have on the order of about 10 to 20% rather revenue. However, for patients, this is great because the savings that are going to result, that's now since 2010 here, is 158 billion. That's a lot of money, even in this day and age of where people talk about trillions in healthcare. But on the other hand, this will also result in the loss of at least 12,000 pharma jobs. I think this number is vastly underestimating the true situation. But at least we're talking about people's livelihoods here as well. And that's not all. Although you see here 2012 is sort of seems to be the consensus year here to be the worst this decade. But in total, between 2010 and 2020, the industry has lost or will lose about $107 billion in revenue due to patent expiration. And that is a new situation because I couldn't find the exact numbers, but the last decade saw, of course, also things going off patent, but not nearly as much. So this decade here really represents the challenge. Now, one reaction to this graph could be, oh, wow, this is 2012 here. All we have to do is wait. And then things will go away by themselves. Well, that prediction might be true, but not in the sense that those protagonists think. So in other words, once this revenue is gone, pharma as we know it will be significantly smaller unless something is being done about it. And is this patent cliff sort of just something that concerns pharma just by itself? No, it isn't. If you're into money making as a whole, as an investor, you'll notice that this trend here is extremely disconcerting. This at once is the 12-month forward price earnings ratio of stocks. It used to be about 18 around 2003, and then essentially up until about 2009, 2010 has been going down to 10. And if PE ratios are not really your game, do take a look at the right-hand side here. This is the price, the actual price over the book price. The book price is what, if you suddenly dissolved instantaneously, is what you'd be getting for the values of your assets. And the value of 2.5 essentially means that there's almost no confidence that pharma has anything left beyond sort of hard assets at this point. Not a very good situation. However, and here now we come to the sort of positive side of things from now on. If you take a look at the number of new molecular entities that have been approved by the FDA over the last decade, and if you take out this sort of 2003, 2004 spurt here, what you do notice is sort of a fairly lackluster level of activity, at least as far as the approvals go. So roughly about 20 per year. That's down from about 40 to 50 between 1980 and 2000. And now in 2011, this was then an estimate, has since been corroborated, there seems to be enhanced activity towards innovation, at least towards new molecular entities. That's a very positive sign, which supposedly continues now in 2012. The first 6 months saw the approval of 14 new NMEs by the FDA. So let's hope this trend continues. So somehow we do need to do something. We can't just wait for revenue to go away and kind of treat this as a law of nature. Now, before I get into my sort of suggestions on what to do, here's what currently seems to be being done, and sort of ordering this from top to bottom in terms of size and importance. The classical move is to slash costs. The cost slashing has gone so far that sometimes I talk to people in pharma and they sort of ponder whether to invite myself for a day because that's already costing money. If you calculate how many minutes you spend thinking about this, it's probably worth a lot more than I could ever cost to get me up there for a day or two, because I don't ride anything else but coach, and my hotel isn't that expensive. What you also see is vastly increased M&A activity, mergers and acquisitions. That makes a lot of sense because if you're an organization, for instance, that can do clinical trials and marketing very well, and you have another organization that can do discovery very well, why not team up? So there's a lot of good in this. This is often being sort of viewed as a sign of confusion by pharma. I don't think that's fair to say that. In fact, this is one of the necessary activities to get the ship right. This is rather a question whether the structure of large pharma companies is commensurate these days with a lot of good discovery, but that's a totally separate issue. A third strategy here, hugely important, and not just from a point of view of making money, is to go into so-called pharmerging markets, so the emerging pharma markets. And those are sort of the four large countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, the BRIC countries, South America and Eastern Europe. There's now a vast amount of wealth accumulating in these regions, and predictably quite a bit of that wealth is being spent on healthcare or health in some way. So there should be opportunities for people who have a good product or service to offer, and indeed, as we will see, this is the case. So a not quite so nice point here is a lot of increased patent litigation activity. This actually keeps a couple of large companies fairly busy. And those, just to give you a very short backdrop of what happens here, one goal of any kind of patent litigation usually is the extension of your timeline and area of protection. And if you're really good at this and always come up with new ways to keep your core activity protected, that one has now sort of entered the sort of conversation here with the term evergreening. It's also interesting that if you get an automatic 30-month extension upon litigation, if you're the originator, you can kind of guess that there's a lot of upside in litigating, and that indeed is what's happening. And last but not least, a lot of diversification. into generics, and they can be actually very profitable, even though they used to be poo-pooed by big pharma, by ethical pharma, because who wants to sell stuff that's off patent? Well, that's actually absolutely not true. If you look at some so-called branded generics, so those that essentially usually come from an originator and where you don't just know the pharmaceutical name, but also the brand name, then you can make surprising amounts of money. One just almost random example is Zithromax by Pfizer, that essentially is clarithromycin, azithromycin. When I talked to the plant manager who runs that plant for Pfizer in Puerto Rico, he told the group of student visitors last March that, oh yeah, they're making lots of money in terms of revenue, and if they had given this whole thing up, they could have essentially shut down a factory. So this is very important to stay busy in generics. Biologics, of course, are a gigantic opportunity because the market share is rising. Many diseases cannot be addressed well by small molecule therapies, but the challenges are extremely different from small molecules. So if you want to be in both technologies, small molecules as well as protein therapeutics or biologics, you essentially need to run almost different research organizations alongside. As we're talking about generics and biologics, the sort of question of biosimilars comes up. That's essentially the generic version of biologics. And we ourselves here at Georgia Tech, by the way, did a study last year on whether we should sort of move towards forming a biosimilars technology platform here at Georgia Tech. Interestingly, what we found is that, first of all, biosimilars are not yet really available in the US because the FDA sort of still hasn't decided how to deal with those. Europe is a little bit further ahead, but that's because there are fewer originators. But if you're not an originator, it's actually quite difficult to get into that game. If you are already in the market, you know exactly what you're doing, it's much easier. Consumer healthcare has been a favorite as well. Usually that's over the counter, and at least in terms of marketing, runs very differently from the rest of pharma. And then, of course, vaccines, a very interesting area. Vaccines, if you ask what is a vaccine, what do you put into a vaccine, you find it's a very complex preparation. On one hand, you have gamma aluminum oxide. On the other hand, you have complex proteins. And what's probably very important to understand is that effectively in vaccines, even we in the US here have a single payer situation. In other words, the government decides how much vaccines they want, what you pay per dose, and that, as you can imagine, can be an interesting scenario if as a company you think you're used to setting the price. So let's go into two sort of examples of what academia can do. And let's start with energizing development itself. Development, of course, is a big word, but I'd like to start with the scenario that you're all probably familiar with, that one of the new trends, actually, by the pharmaceutical industry is to seek stronger ties with academia to speed up drug development. Very interesting. That means the picture here is pharma is slow, academia is fast. I'm not quite sure I would buy into this picture, but I would buy definitely into the picture that academia can do great things for pharma. It just as far as the speeding up goes, I'm not quite so sure. You can see that actually there's a lot of activity going on, but usually this has sort of this air of centralization around it, so that somebody inside the company says, usually high up, all the way up to the CEO, let's go and partner with one of the very sort of favorite institutions, and everything will be okay. That is one way to do it, but let me give you a different picture. And let me take an area that probably needs more help for pharma than many others, and that's anti-infectives. Let me start by saying that bacterial and parasitic diseases are a leading cause of death worldwide. And that, of course, holds true mostly in low-income countries. But there has been a 30-year gap in the development of new antibiotics. We'll get into the reasons down here. So ultimately, antibacterials were only 1.6% of the new molecular entities in the world's 15 largest pharmaceutical companies. And of course, I should put a time range here. That's between 1970 and 2000. And the situation has not improved much, although there are now at least 2 new compounds on the market. Some of them, both of them actually first in class, but target very specialized markets and are doing okay, but don't really solve the problem. So what are the reasons for global failure here? And the scientific problems, they are large but not insurmountable. So I don't think that's a good way to tackle this. This is not any more difficult than other diseases. But the ROI seems to be far greater for medicines for chronic diseases. And of course, if you take a medicine every day, or if you just take it once, that makes a huge difference. So we all need to understand this. Academia especially, because there are still a lot of people in academia who don't know what ROI is. I'm happy to say that as a chemical and biomolecular engineer, I teach process design and economics to our seniors. And if they didn't know what ROI is, I don't think they'd be getting out with a degree, and I think I'm doing something right in that regard. Now, antibiotics, of course, are usually given in short courses, and unnecessary use should be minimized, which sort of doesn't sound very conducive to pushing large loads. On the other hand, you got to sort of take a look at the patient load here to get this done. And of course, most importantly, the development of resistance that limits sort of your marketing potential, especially further down the road in those years between 10 and 20, when the market has accepted a product, you finally sort of get your market share, you have a position, and then you're supposed to cover all your R&D, even those that failed. So that if then resistance hits and your product cannot be used anymore or not as much, that's certainly a big drawback. And of course, generic market for drugs has kept prices low. And on the other hand, I should say anti-infectives often have very high cost of goods. So the input costs are not negligible like in many others. And the regulatory demands are actually not clear. However, what I'd like to leave you with, and you will hear whole sessions on this with good talks in there, is that Georgia Tech has groups working on this problem. So we are addressing this issue. Secondly, let me take an example out of process development. Process development used to be a fringe activity in pharma companies. It was regarded as something you had to do so that it didn't disturb the main course of events, that is, discovery, clinical trials, marketing. Well, if you take a cold, hard look at the manufacturing situation in pharma these days, you'd be surprised. First of all, there's almost no holdup in the system. So if somewhere a factory blows up, for many, many products, you would have a couple of months of supply and that would be it. And to ramp things up takes a couple of months at least. So there is a huge problem in there. And also, pharmaceutical manufacturing tended to be really expensive because nobody really took any care about costs. And only once you take a look at, for instance, making consumer products that in some way sort of have similar characteristics in manufacturing, and compare the cost picture of personal care products with that in pharma, do you realize that there's hardly any industry around that uses its capital less good than pharma, at least traditionally. It's now changing. But you don't just need to sort of sit down and decide you got to work your assets better. It's also a question of people. And so, very interestingly, here, if you take a look at this, the different phases of pharmaceutical development, from discovery all the way to approval, at the very beginning, what you actually should be looking for in your process is speed and selectivity in your catalysts. What you really do not care about yet is yield and productivity. Because if you haven't got, first of all, the right molecular entity, and if you haven't got the right selectivity to make it cleanly so that you don't have any kind of contaminations in there, all these other parameters here are not very important. However, slowly but surely, as time moves along, you then have to not just stay with speed and selectivity, that still remains important, but you got to integrate yield and productivity into the game step by step and at some point you got to essentially optimize all of those variables. This takes a different type of engineer to do this. And so traditional curricula emphasize yield, but nothing else. You never hear much of anything else. If you ask sort of a chemist, what's the productivity of your process, often it's just a blank stare. Whereas yield is something that he or she can answer immediately. So I want to also leave you with the message that Georgia Tech has recognized this years ago. We've adapted our curricula, and so you will get people who can think differently and can synthesize sort of the issues in different situations to come up with the right answer. So last not least, let me sort of give you 2 examples out of green chemistry to show you that there is actually music in this game. And first, I'd like to remind the audience, if you don't already know it, that effectively pharmaceutical processes, while they make great product, are very inefficient. And one way to judge this here is the so-called E factor. Why this is E and not some other letter, well, that's up for debate, but E factor is now a very universally used concept, which essentially means you look at the kilos of waste per kilo of product, but you exclude water. For some historic reason, water was never regarded as something that you needed to worry about. It's not quite true, but in the concept of early development here, water wasn't really your main problem. So if you take a look at all refining or bulk chemicals, your E factor better be close to 1. In other words, you can't make a lot more waste than you make product, or else at that gigantic scale here, 10 to the 6, 10 to the 8 tons per year, you'd be making just mountains of waste that you can't get rid of anywhere, so that's really not a way to go. If you move to fine chemicals, your E factor rises up to about 50. That's already pretty uncomfortable, but pharma typically is between 25 and way more than 100. There are a couple of large processes that are run with E factors of 300 to 500. Okay, well, doesn't sound so good. There are, of course, some very good reasons, because while all refining had 100 years to develop their processes, pharma had on average less than 5. So really, of course, the playing field isn't level here at all, but things need to improve, and not only because of environmental reasons. For the companies themselves, they, of course, should rather think about this as an exercise in saving money, both your variable costs, but also the fixed costs that you have to build into your plant. So let's just take 2 examples. This one here, Sildenafil. And in a class that I run with a colleague in the spring, I never reveal what that is. I sort of expect the first laughs to come up 5 minutes after I put up this overhead. So far, no laughs have ever come up when I explained the issue here, so people apparently don't seem to link the pharmaceutical names with what they hear in advertisement and on TV. First of all, this is a great product. It does sort of fulfill all the Pinsky rules of 5 criteria. And it was developed originally in the beginning of the 90s by Pfizer. And the medicinal chemistry route took 1,300 liters of solvent per kilo of sildenafil citrate. Now the optimized medicinal chemistry route already reduced that by more than a factor of 10. The first commercial route completely went away from solvents such as methylene chloride and essentially relied on solvents such as butanone and ethyl acetate, which are much more easily recoverable and and can be regenerated more easily. But that was definitely not it. After solvent recovery, currently the situation stands at around 6 to 7 liters. In the future, the expectations are that you only use 4 liters of solvent in a multi-step process per kilo of product. And ultimately, you will essentially end up, even though your tonnage, and I don't think that's correct anymore, there's at least 100 tons of Viagra produced, because that's what sildenafil citrate is. But even at 100 tons, this is a very small process, but the footprint here is extremely low. And why should you all care about this? And not because it's green in environmental sense. That's very nice. I acknowledge that. And societally, that's very important. But essentially, Pfizer saves 9 digits in dollars per year with that process over the old one. 9 digits is what you essentially need to spend on about one successful development of a new pharma product. So this is big. Let me come up with an even bigger story. So we've heard about blockbusters. Blockbusters, more than $1 billion in revenue a year, is what everybody used to run after. And there's this notion out there that there cannot be blockbusters anymore. Well, this is a counterexample here. That's Januvia, or sitagliptin is the chemical name. The structure here, interesting but otherwise not too difficult. Produced by Merck since 2006. Anti-type 2 diabetes, oral treatment, great if you do not have to fool around with any kind of syringes, although, as for instance, my colleague Mark Brausen's work attests to, even syringes can be improved because he works on microneedle technology to essentially get painless injections going. This is a first-in-class new treatment here, DPP4, dipeptidyl peptidase 4 inhibitor. And it essentially banks on an important trend, i.e. that obesity and diabetes are tightly linked. And not just in the US, so while you can sort of marvel off the red corner around here, even worldwide, the projection of increase of incidence of diabetes is frightening. So that means for a pharma company here, the overall revenue that you can glean here in 2012 right now is roughly about 50 billion. That is supposed to go to a lot more than 100 billion by 2018. 2018 is only 6 years from now. By the way, these anti-diabetes drugs here in sort of dirty pink, that's sort of what Merck could essentially capitalize on. Of course, down here you've got insulins, all the different ones, including the auxiliary equipment such as insulin pumps, strips, and meters, and the like. A gigantic market that is growing strongly because of this linkage here, and also sort of automatically gets you into the farm emerging market. You see here the revenue increases of major players. That's actually pretty modest in my opinion. So while they were pretty much under 10 to 15% in the year below 2010, they are rising, and at some point will probably approach 25 to 30%. So what about Januvia or sitagliptin? Well, there was a process introduced that was hailed at the time as the greatest thing. In fact, it got the Presidential Green Chemistry Award in 2006. This is a process that starts from the so-called keto amide, focus on this keto group here. And then essentially all you need to do here is reduce that to the R amine. So you need to be chirally pure. You get that done with a rhodium catalyst and hydrogen pressure 250 psi. Very standard reaction. You then remove your rhodium via a treatment with active carbon. And then essentially your first crude product here has 97% enantiomeric excess. That means you have 3% of the wrong product. That's absolutely unacceptable. The FDA will not even look at anything above 1%. So you need to have some steps to purify this up to much larger than 99% EE. So far, so good. Everybody at the time was happy until you realize that steps such as these two here, with some sort of recrystallizations back and forth, contributed enormously to the cost. So a thought was put up whether this keto reduction to amine couldn't be afforded enzymatically. And I myself remember when that idea was put up, when a lot of people at Merck's higher up management said, hey, we're in a real business here. We're not sort of around to discuss exotic technologies. This is never going to work. But somehow, sort of my cohort at Merck was smart enough to put up the right arguments, and they let them develop a new enzyme called transaminase, which even has a cofactor, which sort of a lot of people thought would never ever work, much less be cost effective. However, the fact that you can go straight to 99.95% EE and have an extremely simple workup procedure essentially saved the day. So that process won the Presidential Green Chemistry Award in 2010. just 4 years later, is a marked improvement over current issues. This is the chemical process here, and let's just focus on these two numbers down here, the E factor and then the process mass intensity. Those are coupled because process mass intensity just means that you take you take everything plus the product and scale that to the amount of product. So they're essentially, of course, coupled. And so the chemical process was already pretty okay with 36. The currently run so-called semi-batch enzymatic process decreases that down to 25. A couple of other little improvements here, cycle time and the like. So overall, this is less than half as expensive as the previous process. And what Merck now did, I think, was ingenious. And of course, one thing that you should know is Januvia now has about $3 to $4 billion in revenue. The projections are, and I'm sort of trying to be cautious here, that this likely will be a product that will make more than $10 billion by 2020. And of course, for $10 billion revenue, you're going to do a lot. Anyway, what the development team did is develop a continuous process, one that usually is thought to work only if you're at least at 1,000 tons a year, if not much higher. And if you look at the numbers here, the cycle time again cut by a factor of 2. The E factor now down to 5. That's even better than the Viagra process. So this by itself probably will fund half of Merck's research in the future. So even minor improvements here will either make or break certain research programs at Merck. So it definitely pays to pay attention to your process development here. We ourselves here actually work on a competing technology, just so that we're not, you understand we're not sitting still here. And this sign here, CPD, is our Center for Pharmaceutical Development, financed partially by NSF, partially by companies. Very interesting mode where companies come in and have a vote on what research projects are being worked on. This is a totally different scenario compared to when the professor shows up and says, here's my big spiel and you got to believe it. And now companies shrug their shoulders and possibly walk away. Here, companies and university people really work together on what to do. Last not least, Georgia Tech is getting active in even a different space. What you see here is the island of Puerto Rico with all the different pharma ventures here. This is now 2 years old, so there may be not quite as many anymore, but still at least 90% of all of these sites. Overall, Puerto Rico produces 16 of the top 20 pharmaceutical drugs sold in the US, and just a single year yielded more than $1.5 billion in investment. However, some of the typical issues that we've talked about also plague Puerto Rico. And so a foundation came up now and essentially contributed to Georgia Tech and Puerto Rico having agreed to fund a new innovation center, virtual in the beginning, but then probably having facilities both here at Georgia Tech as well as in Puerto Rico. And this initiative, in no small part, came out of an educational activity that was adjacent to a class called Drug Design Development and Delivery, which a colleague of mine, Mark Brausnitz, and I are teaching. And we, over spring break, went to Puerto Rico and looked at pharmaceutical plants. And what the faculty sees is all these great products here, usually pretty big blockbusters, where you see Humalog. Humira should be on here too. We've once been in there, but it was a long time ago. Wish we could return. What the students see, by the way, of course, is the other part. They look at palm trees. They look at sort of cultural sites. Down here, if you can't identify this, this is the bioluminescence bay, UNESCO World Heritage Site. We take them there on Sunday night. Obviously, it needs to be during dark for them to get them going. And believe it or not, we also visit Bacardi, the rum manufacturer's fermentation plant. And yes, there are samples to be had. So the students see this part, the faculty is happy about this part, everybody wins. And this essentially gave us enough insight and contacts on the island to now proceed with this innovation center. My time is definitely up here, so I want to leave you with the impression that at Georgia Tech, we are essentially open for collaborations, and we are already doing those. Translational research here is a a very fixed part of the venture. Thank you very much for your attention.